Nomenclature,
Mhm.
I didn't read.
Okay.
Is it the case that when these non-bank lenders fail, they're generally judgment proof? I'm wondering if
That may be part of it. They just run away.
they just
Yeah.
run away.
Yeah.
But you do need to. But he's right. You do need to address the possibility of something analogous to common law fraud. I'm sure there's probably something in China,
Mhm.
and maybe explain why that's not a sufficient remedy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And that may, once again, not need to be a very long explanation, but
Sure.
I think it's important
Yeah.
because one of your objectives is to show that the existing regime is not satisfactory,
Right.
so you want to make sure that you've exhausted the different ways
Yeah.
in which
Yeah.
people might have remedies now. Okay. Now, when you get into the securities regulation aspect in Chapter 2, whether this is something that could and should be regulated under a securities-like framework, I did have some questions about that.
Okay.
One of them, and I think it's probably the most important one from a legal standpoint, is you use the United States and the UK and Australia and a few other places as comparators. And for the US, you say the relevant legal framework in which this could be captured is the 1933 and 34 Act under the investment contract component of the definition of a security. And to me, that was pretty convincing. Yes, that would probably be captured by the definition. Most of that stuff would be captured and then subject to disclosure rules and fraud rules and so on. But then you go into the UK and some other places and you say, the way that would be captured is by falling within the definition of a collective investment scheme in the UK or elsewhere. And I haven't gone back and looked at these, but my understanding is that that's keyed to a much broader regulatory regime, which is that if you are a unit in a collective investment scheme as far as British and EU law is concerned, you're not just a security you don't just have a security subject to disclosure and so on. You are basically a mutual fund and you're subject to mutual fund regulation. So here what you're talking about is not just 1933-34 Act regulation, but 1940 Act regulation. And that raised a couple of questions for me. The first is, well, is that also true of the U.S.? Should you be talking about the 1940 Act and whether that stuff would be captured by the definition of an investment company and then be subject to mutual fund regulation, which is a lot more intrusive? And if it's true, then it might raise the question for you. You can't really have. Bless you. I don't think you can really have banking regulation and mutual fund regulation. You can certainly have securities regulation and some sort of banking regulation at the same time, but I don't think you can have a firm being subject to banking regulation and mutual fund type regulation at the same time. So it might raise for you the issue, well, maybe mutual fund type regulation is what's appropriate for a lot of these, or not, but I think you need to talk about it, because that's different from the banking approach. That's basically saying the way we're going to regulate you if what you're offering is basically units in a collective investment vehicle, then we're going to regulate things like your redemption policies and your valuation policies and your disclosure and like the types of investments that you can have in leverage and all of that stuff. That's quite different from, in its premises, from how you regulate a bank. It's premised on more transparency, for example, so it might not be appropriate. But you might need to think about that, because right now, especially when you talk about the European countries, what you're suggesting to me is that, if you're correct in your legal analysis, then in these European countries you would be subject to mutual fund regulation. If what you're doing fits within the definition of a unit in a collective investment vehicle. So if you don't think that's the case, then maybe in Europe you need to say, okay, you would fall within the definition of a securities, but maybe not a unit in a collective investment vehicle. And then, because what you're trying to say is just that disclosure and fraud is what you're after, not the whole mutual fund type regulation.